Hey guys, today we're going to look at textile rates, compare the different sizes of textures applied, and learn about layers. So as you're following along, you'll see this is what my scene looks like. And these are set up to the textile rates per size of the polygon. So if you want to take a screenshot of this or write this information down, go for it. You could see that 12.5 centimeters is equal to a 32 by 32 size polygon. 1 meter is 256 by 256, which is the standard for Planet Coaster. And then we can go down to 25 centimeters is equal to 64 by 64. 2 meters is 512 by 512. 4 meters, which is your standard wall piece, is 1024 by 1024. 50 centimeters is 128 by 128. 6.25 centimeters is a 16 by 16. And 8 meters is the limits of TMTK, which is a 2048 by 2048 texture. So, depending on how pretty you want your object to look, you might use a 2048 for high resolution, but you don't really need to. The reason why Planet Coaster did 1 meter for 256 by 256 is that is pretty much the standard starting point for a texture size. And I have many different scenes set up here to show you an example of why that's a pretty good standard to go with. So looking at our first layer here. So a thing to note is when you're looking at textures to use, whether you make it from scratch or you're borrowing someone's offline to use on your objects, and they say that it's royalty free, but you should always check with the creator of that texture to make sure that what you plan on using it for is what they intended their royalties to be connected to. So for this one, I snagged a photo that was 30 by 30 and scaled it down to 2048. When you get a texture, if you take a small texture and scale it up, it'll get really pixelated because your UI is trying to figure out what to do with each individual pixel and how to spread it across that canvas. Whereas if you get a larger folder or larger picture and compress it, then you'll still keep the integrity of the original image. So this one on a 8 meter polygon at 2048, which is the maximum size for TMTK, looks like this. And then that same texture scaled down to a 2048 looks like this. And then we got 512, 256, 128, 64, 32, and 16. And you can see as the image gets smaller, it starts to pixelate. And by the time you get to the smallest texture size you can use, it's very, very pixelated and hard to tell what that original image actually was. So the standard is 256 by 256 per 1 meter, which is this one. And if you look between the 2048 and the 256, the information is fairly the same. So there really is no actual reason for you to use a texture this big on your object when you can get away with a 256 or a 128, which you can see starts to get pixelated. So that's why, as the guide points out, 1 meter for 256 by 256 as your textile standard rate, because it's a fairly good size to work with. And as far as pixelation goes, it's not that pixelated, and it doesn't really make a difference between this one and this one. Okay, so now we're going to take a 2048 by 2048 and apply it to each size polygon. So this is your 8 meter, your 4, your 1, and so on, multiplied by 2, smaller and smaller. So even on the smaller polygon, it's still maintaining its resolution because it's a large texture applied to a small object. So it doesn't get pixelated. However, this thing is so tiny, why would you bother putting such a large texture on such a small object? So that's something you have to consider. And then this is what happens when I was talking about how you take a small image and you stretch it bigger. So this was a 16 by 16, and it's applied to the bigger and bigger sizes, polygons, and you could see that the 16 by 16 was really pixelated, and applied to the larger polygons, you're seeing every individual blurred pixel applied to those polygons. So when it comes to enlarging a small texture, you don't really want to do that because it looks like crap. And then we go over here, and now this is a 256 texture applied to all size polygons, and you can see we have a fairly good result regardless of how big the polygon is with a 256. And just to do a side by side, this is the actual textile rates. An 8 meter uses a 2048. A 1 meter uses a 256. Now this is the 256 applied to all scales. And you can see we have a fairly good result. So that's a good starting point, is 256. Now here's some examples of different types of materials that you should be using the different scales of polygons for. So right here, this is the 16 by 16. And this would be a flexicolored object or texture. And then moving up from that, the 32 by 32 would be some rope. The 64 by 64, you can get a fairly good wooden texture with that one. And then we go up into metal, which gives you a good result at 128 by 128. And then if you're making animals, because there's so many lines and grooves and highlights in the shader, minimum you want to go with is 256. And this is the texture skin for my chipmunk. Okay, so now we'll go into file sizes. Okay, so with the 2048 by 2048, all of these textures here are diffused, which means they have color information, shading, and highlights. So a diffuse map at base color map at 2048 by 2048 comes out to 12 megabytes. And this is just for the base color. So if you times that by, say, 7 or 6, well, flexi objects usually are about 6 maps, so you times that 12 megabytes for this size image times 6, And now you can understand where that 25 megabytes and higher comes from on some TMTK objects. And then we get down here to 1024 by 1024, and we're looking at 3 megabytes now. There's a big jump between the two, you see that? And again, 6 maps applied, and now you can see where the file size is. 512 by 512 is just under 1 megabyte. And then Plinko Standard 256 by 256 is 208 gigabytes. So after all your maps, you'll probably come out to about 1 megabyte. And then the compiler will compress it, and so you'll have an object that's probably around 0.5 megabytes. And then using 128s is 64. 64s is about 28.3. 32 is 19.3. And 16 by 16 is 17.1. So this is a really small file. So this one and this one are the best ones to use for flexi maps, because flexi maps repeat over the polygonal space over and over again, so you don't need them to be super huge unless you're say using a roughness map to show the individual crevices of a rock texture. But if it's just a flat plain color, then going with these two is good, and that'll make your file size for your object really, really small. Alright, so let's go into layering. When you have an object scene that looks like this, one big key thing that I do is I make sure that I properly name everything so I know exactly what it is. And by default, Blender, when you duplicate things, it'll make a 0.001. You have the object again, it's 0.002, and so forth. But even with this, like this, I could easily be annoyingly and mindlessly clicking to figure out what is what when I'm working on my scene. So a way that you can separate your objects, and the way I've set it up for this tutorial, is I've used visgroup layers. So by clicking on my individual layers, you can see I have things separated. And to do that, all you have to do is, in object mode, click on the object, and once it is highlighted, you push the on your keypad, push M, and then select which layer you want to apply that object. So for this one, we're going to push M and put it right here. And now it's no longer in this layer, it's in this layer. So you can use your layers there to group objects, and if you want to move it back from this one over to that one with it highlighted in object mode, you push M again and put it back in the other layer, and now it's there. So that's, one really cool thing that you can do in Blender to help you organize your scenes. So when you get something that's super complex like this, you're not constantly doing this, trying to figure out where the object is that you're trying to work on. Instead, you have it grouped neatly in layers. Now, a thing to note is, see how these are grayed out, and this is orange? The reason why that is orange is because this layer right here is currently selected and active. So when you move into the next layer, this layer isn't active until you select an object. Now that this object has been selected, now this layer is active. But I could click over here, and this layer isn't active yet until I select something within this scene. Alright, so going back to textile rates, as you can see, when an object is super tiny, I mean, even from this viewpoint, you don't really see the details on it unless you're zoomed in. So there really isn't any reason why you should be putting a large set of textures on something that small. Or if you have something this big, you don't really need to use a texture that's that big for this large object, because a 256 on that large polygon looks really good. And gives us a similar result to the 2048. I mean, it's not 100% perfect, but this one does look a little better than that one, even though this one's more detailed because of the faded effect. So, and the people using your object won't know the difference between the texture sizes you used, but they will notice the difference in performance, because this larger texture being rendered in-game, in real time, is what is causing your players lag when they start using more and more of the object. Whereas this one with the smaller texture is a smaller render, and as they use more and more of the object, they're not going to experience as much lag. Now, the guys with the crappier computers, the 128 range to 256 is good for them, and the guys with the stronger computers can deal with the 1024 and 2048s. But that's related to the GPU processing and not the computer processor. As far as polygons go, it doesn't really matter how many polygons you use on an object, because that doesn't actually affect the file size. But the more faces you have with larger textures applied to them, the more their GPU has to work to render every single face of that object. Whereas if you use a smaller texture and an object with less polygons, then you can see where it becomes important and why it's good to practice optimizing tricks. Alright, so now that you guys have an idea of how layers work and how textile rates work and best use of the different scales and sizes, have fun. Look forward to seeing what you guys create. Have a great day. Bye.